Okay. So we're on there, and we're just going to start a Facebook Live as well. All right. And we're live. What just happened? That just like nearly took my eyes out. All right, let me get to the stuff. It's important. Okay. Okay. Cool. All right, we are live. Form better thing. I'm presenting my flip flops because I feel like it. All right.
You.
Because my socks are also really wet.
I want to tell you nothing.
That's really the true reason, to be completely honest. And I also didn't want to smell like death when I presented for you guys, so I took a shower. Hope you guys don't mind that. Anyway, so today, some of this is review, some of this is kind of new stuff for people, especially those that are here, those that might be kind of watching remotely. But I want to specifically look at the FMS, the role of the functional movement screen, which is probably one of the most bespoke, common tests within our industry. And we're going to kind of examine it, but we're also going to look at kind of the greater picture, which is strategy sessions. So how do we specifically incorporate the FMS here at Velocity? Because the fact of the matter is, the FMS is an amazing tool, but it's not the only tool. And if you guys recall last time when we were talking about kind of the basic structures of resistance training, we were talking about kind of the basics behind programming, we kind of made this distinction between what I call systems and what I call principles. We basically said a system. And there was a definition in the last slide, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, principles are guidelines. They effectively kind of govern, whereas a system is how you take a certain set of principles and you actually utilize them. So an example, Mike Boyle is a big single-leg, single-arm, unilateral systems practitioner. He is a big believer in unilateral work compared to bilateral work. His work encompasses that unilateral system. Now, it's based on certain principles. All right, so again, I would argue it's still based on principles of overload. I mean, his guys get better for some reason, because if his program didn't work, he would suck, and we wouldn't follow him, and we wouldn't care about listening to him at a place like Perform Better, But does that mean that he's hands down, thou shalt not deviate, whatever Mike Boyle says is gospel? No. This is where I always challenge people to think critically, and that goes for not only Mike Boyle stuff, that goes for anybody's stuff, my stuff included. Fact of the matter is, if you have an understanding of the principles, you can make better decisions as a practitioner. That's where we talk about that toolbox. You guys hear me say it all the time to the athletes. I call it like an athletic toolbox when we talk about cutting, pivoting, backpedaling, all the things you were asking about kind of earlier, Derek. Hip turns, hip swivels, all the things that we address in the movement curriculum, those are tools. Well, guess what? If you understand periodization, if you understand unilateral training, bilateral training, if you understand all these different principles and how they fit together, you're going to have a lot more to work with, just like a painter has a lot more colors and palettes to work with as opposed to just being stuck with 4 or 5 primaries. So the FMS is a system, so just kind of building off of that, but it's a very popular one. So love it, hate it, whatever your thoughts are on it, it's here to stay. And I think it's really important that we understand kind of what it is, how it came to be, and why it has a lot of pros, but actually we'll look at it critically too, why it has a little bit of cons as well. But that is just one piece of the puzzle we're going to address today. The other thing is just a little bit of baseline testing in general, and this is where we get into the strategy sessions. Because as you guys are aware, one of the big things we do here is we perform strategy sessions. We do that for our adults, we do that for our youth athletes. This is our first line of touch when we're working with a prospective person off the street who's like, hey, I heard of you guys, I'm interested. What do you have to offer? My son needs to get faster, or I need to lose a little bit of weight. What can you do for me? So I think what's really interesting about strategy sessions is not only is it an invaluable sales tool, but it's really our first way of basically establishing our credibility. Basically saying, like, we're awesome, we know our shit, you're going to be stupid if you train with anybody else. And I actually say those exact words. I don't. Anyway.
Say them in a nice way.
I say them in a nice way. But in all seriousness, that is basically what we're doing. So just to even kind of fill you guys in, this is actually perfect segue. Awesome. This is what happens when you play with your cats using the laser pointer. I think I might have ran out of juice. Derek, could you run down and just see if we have any AAA batteries anywhere?
Okay.
Worst case,
I remember one inside the...
Worst case, I hit the play button. Ugh, amateur hour. Right.
Wait. AAA?
AAA. Okay.
The little ones.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, even though he's out of the room, Why do we assess? I'm going to let you two guys talk about it amongst yourself, and we'll do more like 2.5 minutes. So just looking at the whole thing of creating some form of assessment. Doesn't have to be the FMS. Why do we assess? And go.
Find weaknesses, assess progression.
Create a baseline.
Good answers.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, we're good. No, you guys are absolutely right.
Programming purposes, yeah, hit on their weaknesses, you
Yeah.
know, what they need the most.
No, you're 100% right. I mean, how can we formulate any type of program for anybody if we don't have some baseline measurements, if we don't know what we're starting with? And again, it's ultimately what we decide is important. So if it's someone who interested in losing weight, probably makes sense for us to do one of our in-bodies to see how much body fat mass are they actually carrying. You know, if it's someone who's looking to get faster, well, how fast are they right now? You know, that kind of makes sense. They still make these with the thing that you can test it. Did you test it?
I did not. That's
No, it's not. I lied.
Sorry.
No, I'm just saying it's I thought it was those ones you could like push the button on.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah, those things were the
It
coolest.
was in a bad spot.
It
though.
works.
You
It
push
works.
the corner, it hurt.
I know. It was like it was just horrible, but you'd still do it just to be like, does this bad boy have juice?
They're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah,
This
I
you don't know what we're talking
no
about. Yeah.
idea.
What? Derek, did you break it already? I'm just picking on
I
you.
just found it in a bin, so.
Standard. All right, guys. Yeah, we're working out. Well, here's the thing too, and you said it best. You know, we do it to create these kind of baselines. Well, you'd never drive a vehicle without gauges, you know, or if you ever had the pleasure of doing that, like an old car, like I did, where the gauges stopped working. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of take a look at traffic. I mean, you know, being all of us established drivers, like you know when you're going like 40 miles per hour. You know when you're not going 40 miles per hour. You know, I mean, you have an idea, but fact of the matter is, if we don't have these baseline measures, if we don't have this kind of criteria, it becomes very hard. Did this person get better? By whatever metric we decide. Did they lose weight? Did they improve their 40 time? Did they get stronger? Well, again, if we don't have these baselines, we just don't know. So we need to have some sort of baseline. Now, that's the most important thing. And again, this is just generic stuff, all right? So if we actually talk about the FMS, like I said, this is kind of what we tend to use in this country and has become very, very popular. You know, so the FMS, Functional Movement Screen, all right, it's a movement screening process to demonstrate the quality of movement as well as what a patient possesses, or client, member, whatever you want to call it, all right? So we screen the movement and the risk, and as it pertains to exercise, and basically this concept of activity and kind of work capacity. So again, it's this musculoskeletal screen, which I think we can all appreciate, all right? But here's the biggest thing, and this is where I think sometimes the waters get a little bit muddy, all right? It is a screen. It's not meant to diagnose, and that's even coming from Greg Cook's mouth himself, all right? And I think where we can fall into the trap a little bit, especially coming more from strength and conditioning backgrounds, is we say, oh, you know, you have poor shoulder internal rotation, or, oh, you know, you have upper cross syndrome and stuff. Yes, there may be validity in that statement, but again, I'm not a medical practitioner. I can't diagnose that. I don't have the right to do that, all right? So this is where we just have to kind of stay in our lanes. But I think it gives us an idea of what is kind of going on as well. You know, there is a sister version of this test, the SFMA. We won't really talk about this here, but a much more kind of clinical one that's part of the same kind of family. But like I said, the purpose is to screen. It's not to diagnose. And I think it's very important that we make that differentiation from the outset. So in terms of the actual principles, when you think of the guys like Lee Burton, Greg Cook, the people that actually created this thing many years ago, you know, and Mike Boyle is a big believer of this as well. The FMS basically follows this joint-by-joint approach. All right, so what it's saying is that the joints throughout the body alternate in terms of their needs for mobility and stability. All right, so even if we look at the first ray of the foot, so if we look at basically, you know, your big toe, that's not even seen in this. But we see kind of these different kind of changes between the joints. So if we start off kind of first, well, for argument's sake, we'll say the ankle, we want to have mobility within the ankle. We then move up to the modified hinge joint, which of course is our knee. All right, that's where we want to have a little bit more stability. I mean, think about just kind of the multiplanar kind of movements of your ankles. All right, ankles, we have a little bit of inversion, eversion. Okay, we have flexion, we have some sort of extension qualities. You know, if we talk a little bit about kind of the knee, well, we basically just have flexion and extension. Yes, from an arthrokinematic standpoint, there is a little bit of medial deviation, especially when your knee is bent, so you guys can actually feel that. But as soon as we extend that leg, we lose that. All right, just because of the joints in and around that knee, just kind of, not the joints, excuse me, the ligaments in and around that knee getting a lot more kind of taut. But the fact of the matter is, our knee wants to be more stable compared to the ankle. Then we get to the hip, which we can appreciate, modified ball and socket joint. That has a lot of mobility, okay, especially the way that acetabulum the head of the femur sits into that acetabulum. Then we get into more of the lumbar spine. We want kind of more stability, thoracic spine mobility. You guys get the idea. We work kind of up that kinetic chain. The issue, which I think we can all appreciate, is sometimes this goes wrong. So you were talking about dorsiflexion, right? So again, if we now lose some of that mobility in the ankle, well, the joint-by-joint approach basically says that our body is going to try to find that motion elsewhere. It's not like it just goes away. It's like we want this kind of state of equilibrium. So what's going to happen is the next joint up, in this case, which just so happens to be the knee, now that's going to try to almost compensate for that lack of mobility in the ankle. So now that knee is going to start to behave a little bit differently. All right? And then what happens is you get this kind of railroad kind of chain effect up the kinetic chain. So this is why, when we see this all the time, a lot of times when people have lower back pain, lumbar spine kind of issues, it's usually a decent amount of time attributed to having thoracic spine issues. Okay, they lose the ability to rotate through that thoracic spine. So again, what's going to happen is the lumbar spine underneath, which isn't really meant for doing that, is going to gradually start to try to take over. So as a result of that, from an arthrokinematic standpoint, now all of a sudden we're going to see some of those small compensations. And that's where people get that pain. So the problem, or the old way of doing it, was if I have lower back pain, what do you think I would try to treat? Old way of doing things.
Lower back.
Your lower back. All right? And surprise, surprise, people weren't always getting better because you were training basically the symptoms, not the root cause. It was a thoracic spine issue, not necessarily a lumbar spine issue. And this is where, if you look at like Myers and some of their work, and you look at these like fascial lines, these fascial trains, what's so interesting is the intricate kind of fascial planes kind of throughout the body. You can go on a cadaver and you can pull, on, the plantar fascia, and you'll see their shoulder move. It just shows how kind of crazy and interconnected things are. So, one of the first coaches who worked here, Vinny Kaggs, he's in some of these videos actually. I remember him telling me a story because he used to work for the Chicago Bears, and he was saying the strength coach at the time, Rusty, I forgot his last name, but when Brian Urlacher was with the Bears, he had some really bad hamstring stuff. Like his hamstrings were always going. And one of the things that the head strength coach at the Bears prohibited him from doing, even from an upper body modified program, was like chin-ups and pulling variations. And the reason for that was because of the fascial lines, the way the latissimus kind of, the synergistic relationship it had with the hamstrings, you were still getting tension through the hamstring muscle group from that vertical pulling action. So he just analyzed that through fascial lines. So the whole point was things were kind of much more intertwined than we necessarily thought, which is really kind of fascinating. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but like I said, I think it's important to understand that this joint-by-joint approach, this is basically what the FMS is based upon. All right, so what we're trying to see is we're trying to basically look at these main key areas of the body and just try to figure out, too, where's some just general dysfunction. So what do you guys think, in your experience working with the people that we work with, if you had to throw everyone in a bucket, 9 times out of 10, what are some of the biggest dysfunctions that you see that literally like 9 out of 10 people will have walking through these doors? Hip
mobility.
Yep. What else?
Forward neck.
Forward neck. Yep. So already we're talking like upper cross syndrome.
Pelvic tilt.
Pelvic tilt. Yep. Oh man, you guys are good. Anything else?
Rounded shoulders.
Rounded shoulders. Yep. So I would say excessive kyphosis, shortened pec minor. They're internally rotated. Forward head posture. All right. A lot of tight psoas, weak psoas, because we need to make that distinction. Internally rotated. Poor ankle dorsiflexion. And how's their T-spines looking on the whole? Stiff and jammed up. So this is a thing too. Everybody has the same stuff if you really kind of look at it. It's very, very rare that we get someone that exhibits or is missing out on all of those mechanisms. This is where I'm not going to be as presumptuous as some of the other people, like a Pat Davidson, who I know is kind of being facetious too, will say, like, I don't need to do an FMS. I already know your deal. I can just look at you. And he's, very deep into PRI and some of these some of these autonomic nervous system function, high-level neurophysiology stuff. But the fact of the matter is, 9 times out of 10, and I actually did a longitudinal thing when we first opened for the first 2 or 3 years where I would keep everyone's FMSs. And you know what? Like everyone, and I took an average, and I actually plotted it on one of those like spider graphs, and guess what? Everything you guys said, everyone had anterior pelvic tilt, internally rotated shoulder, like everyone had the same stuff. Maybe slightly different degrees, but 9 times out of 10, that's what you're dealing with. So what do we need to do? We need to find ways of countering these things, which we'll get into in a little bit. So I know this kind of looks a little bit crazy. This is taken from our literature. This is just a very brief definition of each of the 7 tests that are in the FMS and effectively what they do. All right, because one of the interesting things as well is when we look at the FMS, what's really cool about it is everything is kind of integrated. So what I like about it is if you see, for instance, poor ankle dorsiflexion in the deep squat, you're going to see that elsewhere. You're going to see that in the inline lunge, for example. All right, if we see a knee valgus in the inline lunge or the deep squat, you're going to see it in other places as well. So I think this is what's really kind of interesting is it gives you multiple ways of assessing the same kind of qualities, and you're going to see kind of similar trends. So I think that's what's kind of nice about it is it kind of gives you a few different snapshots of a particular joint from different 3-dimensional angles, and it allows you to make kind of a better decision. So I won't kind of read all these. They're here, and like I said, I'll upload all this stuff kind of later. But fact of the matter is we're looking at these different patterns. Your ability to control, your ability to stabilize, but your also ability to be mobile in certain joints as well. That's what we're trying to do. All right, straight-legged raise. This is an interesting one too. So the shoulder mobility reaching movement pattern demonstrates natural. What the?
Yeah, I
That's
noticed
not
that
supposed
too.
to be there.
I was like,
Oh, they put it. He entered it twice. Wow, that's embarrassing.
Oh.
He forgot it. All right. Yeah, he literally entered it twice. Whoever wrote that, Brandon. I know who wrote that. Okay, so here's what I just want to do for a second. Just gives you an idea. I'll look at the straight-legged raise. Now, the reason I wanted to bring that one up is everyone thinks that when you look at straight-legged raise, everyone's like, oh, all you're doing is you're looking at hamstring function. You're not. What else do you think you're looking at? I mean, of course, hamstring's going to play a part of it. So again, just to recap, this is where they're lying on their back. They're in that supine position. Leg is straight. They're trying to lift that leg, trying to get it up to 90 degrees.
Hip mobility / psoas strength.
Yes. You guys are absolutely right too. I would also argue, but to your point, pelvic control, I'd also look at kind of deep core musculature as well, because if they're not able to stabilize, and this is some of the dead giveaways. So what are some of the ways that you guys think people cheat on that test? So I mean, just to recap, when they're doing the lying alternating single leg raise, they're supposed to have the kit directly underneath their knees. They're lying flat on their back, palms are up. So again, whatever leg is not moving is supposed to stay back of the knee on top of that board. What are some ways people can cheat to try to get more range? Because we do see it.
like bend both knees.
Well, exactly. So they'll bend their knees, so they'll lose contact. That's an automatic yellow card.
Rotate them out.
That's the other one that you see too. Is when people try to compensate and find more range, what they'll do is they'll externally rotate the trail leg. So they'll turn that leg out to try to find kind of more range. But I think what's nice. Not nice, but I think what's interesting about that is it just highlights the premise of how this test was conducted. Like I said, we're looking at this joint-by-joint approach. So you're going to try to find that range of motion in some other way. And what's really interesting is, it's not like you consciously think, oh, my thoracic spine is jammed up, I better use my lumbar. That doesn't go through your head. Your body just kind of knows to do it. But I think over time, where the issue becomes, problematic, is it's almost like a cavity. It's just in the beginning, it's not so bad, but gradually it gets worse, it gets worse, it gets worse. And then finally you're doing something that just gives out and it breaks down. And that's where we see more of these kind of chronic kind of issues. That's where we also see poor tissue quality as well. So if we actually take a look at that, so we actually looked more from a structural standpoint at why people have some of these injuries and stuff, but think a little bit bigger. What else is another huge issue in terms of just general health, not only for athletes, but for people? And I'll give you a hint. It is supposedly the number one root cause of all disease, mortality. It's probably the number one reason that people get messed up. All right, what do you think that is?
I'm just gonna go sedentary lifestyle.
You're on the right page. That's part of it. But think kind of from a biochemical process. I'll give you a hint. It begins with an I. It's a necessary part of the healing process as well.
Inflammation.
Inflammation. Absolutely. And we just tend to think of inflammation like, oh, I rolled my ankle and it blew up. Okay, I mean, there's a reason for that. There's certain heat proteins. There's this whole kind of metabolic cascade that occurs. We have leukocytes flood that site in order to start the tissue healing process. So we need inflammation to a point. It's an adaptive mechanism. But if we're in this chronically inflamed state all the time, that's going to have an impact on tissue quality. That's like one of the things that I still can't wrap my head around. I mean, as you guys know, I have 2 cats because I'm awesome. But why? But what? I was looking at this the other day. How come my cats can jump on shit, run around? They're not they don't have to do mobility drills. They just have good tissue quality. Whereas a natural person, Like again, like if I were to try to like jump on top of this building, it wouldn't go too well, and I'd probably break something. Like I need to like do my mobility. Why is that? And I think part of it too is it's just tissue quality. You know, so it's not only just how we live. You know, if you get into like Eastern medicine, and this is where people kind of might find a little bit woo-woo and stuff like that, but you know, do we store emotions in tissue? Do we have stress in tissue? You know, if we have poor diets, we're in this constant inflamed state, tissue becomes shortened, it becomes necrotic. We have all these inflammatory markers, which means the healing process. As you guys know, when we train, we're breaking down tissue in order to try to rebuild new tissue. Well, guess what? If we have poor tissue quality in the first place, you know, that inflammation is not going to go away. It's going to mitigate any anabolic response. And I know I'm kind of going off on some tangents, but this is where nutrition, all this stuff comes together. You know, so I think not only are we just looking at from a musculoskeletal standpoint, what's wrong with your hip, what's going on with your ankle, but I do think it's important that as practitioners, we always look at the bigger picture too. You know, is inflammation being a really big piece of this? You know, and I think, unfortunately, you know, you said it too, Josh. I mean, this is just the world we live in, the sedentary lifestyle. People eat shit all the time. And the problem is it isn't just, you know, the obvious is, are you crushing McDonald's? Are you going to Burger King? Even healthy choices, you know, a lot of salad dressings and things like that, they have a whole bunch of like canola oil and inflammatory oils and stuff. Like even things that we think are healthy, when you look through the labels, it's hard, man. And this is, I think, part of the problem is how do we find ways to kind of navigate this stuff. But anyway, we're going to look at kind of the bigger picture, the strategy session. All right, so this is just an old video from kind of corporate where it just kind of walks you through the FMS as well as the other tests, which we'll get into in a second.
Ooh, corporate videos. Yeah.
Looking at our simplified integrated assessment, today we're going to go through all of our tests, record the results in the tablet, create a report so that we can see where the athlete's at and what their baseline looks like. First movement in the FMS is the basic overhead squat. This is a fundamental movement of squatting, looking at ranges of motion in the ankle, hip, knee, and shoulder. Overhead squat. One more. Good. Next up in the FMS, we have the hurdle step over. This is looking at basic step over mechanics and looking at stability on one leg. Here we go. One more time each side. Let's go to these multi-side tests. We're taking the lowest score from each side. You can input it on the tablet. Next move in the FMS is the inline lunge. Here we're looking at split stance mechanics, the ability to level lower under stability. Switch it up. Good. Next up in the FMS, we've got shoulder mobility. Well, here we're looking at shoulder mobility and functioning both internal and external rotation. Coach. Switch. Good. With the shoulder mobility test, we also have a clearing test looking for pain with impingement. Good. Okay. Okay. Check. Okay. Next test for the functional movement screen is the active straight leg raise. We're looking at a lot of things for this test beyond just hamstring mobility. We're looking at hip stability, core stability, and the ability to lift a single leg and keep hip in position. Here we go, coach.
A plus, we know.
Switch. Switch. Good. Next test for the functional movement screen, we're looking at trunk stability push-up. This is a measure of upper body strength as well as the ability for the athlete to keep his whole body in line and initiate core stability and pressing movement. Here we go. clear test is looking for pain in the lower back. This is common among a lot of our athletes. We're looking for pain in flexion and extension of the lumbar spine. Okay, switch. Okay, excellent. Last test, the functional movement screen, we're looking at the rotary stability. Here we're looking at the athlete's ability to maintain stability and control throughout the transverse plane, going from 4 points of contact to 2. Here we go.
That was so hard. I know.
It's like impossible.
Ugh.
The only people I've seen who can just crush it,
Yep.
gymnasts and professional dancers.
After a brief dynamic warm-up, we're going to go into our performance protocols. The vertical jump is the first test, looking at lower body explosive power.
Yeah, guys, I know it's kind of hard to see, but I'll upload all this.
There we go. One more coach seating at the whole rack.
It's actually okay, like on a laptop. I think it's just the sun.
Our next performance test is a hexagon agility test. We're looking at quickness and total body control.
Good. Yeah, I know, it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Our next performance test is a 10 and 20 yard. We're looking at both movement mechanics as well as acceleration time and transition time. Our next performance test is the 5-10-5 Pro Agility. Here we're looking at acceleration to rapid change of direction, looking at eccentric strength and the ability to change direction quickly.
5-10-5 what?
5-10-5.
Our last performance test is a 300-yard shuttle. Here we're looking at anaerobic energy system development as well as the ability to recover in a 2-minute rest between trials, and then we add both scores together. Once you completed the data entry for the simplified assessment, you can send the athlete for a drink of water, and then you should be able to print the report from the tablet itself, and then go straight into the post-assessment conference.
So that we can't do anymore, but I'll explain that kind of in a second bit. But like I said, just wanted you guys to just kind of see that as a little bit of review. I mean, you've seen me do it now. Coincidentally, I actually have one of these at 4 o'clock, so you'll get a chance to actually see me do it kind of firsthand. But just as we kind of just finish up, just kind of again, just looking more kind of at the screening, so just kind of bringing it back to kind of the FMS before we dive a little bit deeper into the actual assessment kind of practice as well. You know, another kind of way of looking at this too, you know, is a simplified, almost like equation, is, you know, if we look at injury, for example, if load exceeds your work capacity, your biological power, if we go back to kind of that initial presentation I did last time, that's where we tend to see the greatest degree of injury. All right, if we have load that's less than capacity, all right, that's what we tend to associate with more of a rehabilitation setting. And then when we have kind of capacity kind of being kind of equal to kind of load, that's kind of our prevention strategy. All right, so again, this is an oversimplified way of looking at things, but it's just basically saying in so many words, we're just trying to get that balance right. You know, if load is greater, I mean, this is where you do get hurt in the weight room. If all of a sudden you have a capacity to maybe back squat 200 pounds and you decide to put 300 on the bar without a spotter, and you're not a very good squatter anyway, and you have a bad knee, probably not a good idea. All right, question?
Could you elaborate on prevention a little bit?
Well, prevention strategies, I mean, everything that we do, I would argue, is a preventative strategy. You know, and I think when we tend to think kind of prevention strategies, we think prehabilitation, which is another kind of buzzword kind of within our industry. So rehab we associate with more kind of athletic training, sports medicine, so you get hurt, you tear your hamstring. All right? If you were to do nothing and just wait for that hamstring to heal, it will heal to a certain degree. But if you think you're going to be able to go back and perform competitively, well, you're going to have some problems because now you have scar tissue. Now you have weakened muscle kind of connections. Now you have faulty movement mechanics. You know, I mean, there's that old adage of the doctor where it's like, why you walk with a limp, but you don't have to walk with a limp anymore. Like your leg's actually okay. You know, fact of the matter is, you know, our body has these amazing healing capacities, but if you ever had a scar, you ever had, you know, some sort of torn muscle, anybody here ever roll their ankle? Everybody. You know, if you ever play basketball, you're not a very good basketball player if you didn't roll your ankle at some point. But fact of the matter is, you know, this is what we tend to associate with rehabilitation, is restoring that optimal function, okay? Now, prevention, of course, I would argue that what we do is a preventative strategy. All right, if I get you strong, you know, and this is what we tell people, you know, strength is the single most important thing you can do for an athlete. I say that again very loosely. Of course, I want to make sure that I'm focusing on agility. Yes, I want to focus on deceleration, which we'll get into in a second. But actually, even if I take a look at this board, deceleration, injury reduction, age-specific training, everything comes down to strength. You know, strength is a precursor for power, so you cannot be a powerful athlete without being strong. I'll say that one more time. You cannot be a powerful athlete without being strong. And we need to develop strength in a certain way within the weight room. We know, of course, that there's this long-term athlete development model. You know, the way that I train strength, and this is where when we did see that that presentation when he was talking about working with youth athletes to perform better, he did a really good job. He talked about, you know, specific age adaptations. There are certain times where I can maximize speed. You know, one of the challenges, for instance, if you try to take 12-year-olds and train them anaerobically, you know, do a whole bunch of like hard shuttles, you're not really going to get that adaptation. They haven't evolved that in their bodies yet. So it's almost a bit premature. You can actually do some kind of damage over time by blunting certain adaptations. But the fact of the matter is, I can still get people strong. Now, we know, for instance, when we work with young athletes, you know, you can have a stimulus as low as 40% of an estimated 1 rep max, and you're actually going to get someone stronger. As you get older, as you start to evolve, that's not necessarily the case. But again, we want to get people strong. Think of the sport you play, rugby. If I'm stronger than you and you try running into me, it's not going to end well for you. Or if I run through you, it's not going to end well for you. You know, so this is where if I can get you stronger, if you're able to take those collisions better, you're going to be able to withstand those impacts. But even back to what we were talking about before we even started this, you know, strength is also a function, particularly eccentric strength, of landing mechanics. You know, this is why I think that poor guy got crucified over the weekend. Because the whole thought process was, well, hold on a second, deceleration, stopping. I mean, this is where we tend to associate more injuries. It's very rare that someone, you know, hurts themselves, blows out an ACL as they're about to jump. I've never seen that where someone's like about to jump and they go down. I mean, it happens. Nothing out, you know, of course things can happen, but it's a lot more as soon as they come down from that landing that all of a sudden the knee buckles in, we get that tear, they go down for the count. That's what we tend to associate it with more. You know, or when they're trying to rapidly decelerate. All right, hamstrings are a little bit different. I mean, sometimes those tend to be associated with more kind of acceleration. But fact of the matter is, we want to basically have a strength and conditioning program that's going to improve capacity for our athletes. But in the same token, we need to have this progressive load so that they can handle more work. And that's the whole thing. We want to take greater capacity. Because again, if I'm trying to do things that are outside of your capacity, all right, so let's just say, for instance, you know, and think about it too. A lot of times injury happens. Laura, I'll ask you. You're the medically trained one. Does injury happen usually more when athletes are fresh or when they're fatigued? Yeah, more often than not, that hamstring goes when you've already been in the middle of the game. It's usually not off the opening tip-off, you know. So
Usually the last. It's usually the end of the game.
It's usually at the very end of the game. Exactly. Everyone's tired. I mean, all of a sudden, technique starts to break down a little bit, as it invariably does. You know, or if someone does get hurt in the weight room, it's not usually during that first repetition. You know, it's towards the end where all of a sudden something just kind of gives out. So this is where we want to make sure our programs, whether it's speed training, strength training, whatever it is, we need to get that loading right. You know, we talked about the effectiveness last time. If a program, if the weight is too light, which is I think what we see a lot with our adult clients, you know, they'll grab the little 10-pound dumbbells. You know, yeah, that was really hard. Sure about that? Because it looks like you could have done another 7. But it's how do we kind of articulate that, you know, and get them kind of comfortable. We want to try to kind of improve that load, which again is going to help serve that capacity. So this is the concept of corrective exercise we see all the time. So what does Mike Robertson define as corrective exercise? Corrective exercise is an approach where an assessment is used to determine specific weakness and or limitations of the athlete. This assessment drives the programming process where a systematic and progressive approach is used to reduce the likelihood of injury and improve performance. I think that's a perfect way, a perfect summation of what it is. So why do we use it? Corrective exercises are any exercises that are put in a systematic and progressive order that will help develop an athlete or an individual. So when we tend to think of corrective exercises, we tend to think of our warm-up stuff. Bird dogs, we think of dead bugs, we think of, band pull-aparts and stuff. I would argue a squat is corrective exercise if I can improve your range of motion through the hip. I would argue, anything that gives me anterior loading, like a carry, is corrective exercise. I would argue a sled push, which produces greater work capacity, so you're not gassed at the end of the game, which reduces the likelihood of injury. What I'm getting at is everything's corrective exercise if it's done correctly and safely. And this is where I think sometimes we lose in my opinion, the baby for the bathwater. We'll see practitioners they have an hour with an athlete, and they'll spend every 45 minutes of that just doing bird dogs and trying to set their pelvis and trying to correct that internal rotation. And they're a football player trying to get ready for preseason, and we've just done 2 weeks of that. Have they gotten stronger in that period of time? Not as much, maybe, as they probably could. One of my favorite stories of all time. It was really cool, actually. So there's a guy named Dan Baker. He's like the head of the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association, really, really well-known researcher in the world. And he was giving a presentation at the UK SCA. And he just did this awesome presentation showing what he was doing with like elite combat athletes, like world-class rugby athletes, like just savage people. And some guy in the audience was like, Dan, like, what do you do for rehab and prehab? And he just looks, and he literally goes up to the guy, so like, he was where like you were, Laura, and he just looks at him and he goes, winning's my prehab. He just walked back. And he says, you don't have to worry about injuries when you're smashing teams. But he was joking. And then of course he did stuff, but his point was, back to let's just put it this way, Derek, if you and I are training, all right, let's just say we'll use your collision sport, we're playing rugby, okay, and, okay, let's say, you have a perfect 21 on the FMS, all right, I have a 14, okay, I have dysfunction, just like anybody, but you are Mr. Perfect in that regard. And you're doing tons of corrective exercises and blah, blah, blah. I'm getting stronger, focusing on those things. Yeah, I might have increased risk of injury, but you know what? If I can outlift you, if I'm stronger than you, more powerful than you, I'm going to win the collision. And and this is what Dan Baker said. He's like, you know what else is bad for an overhead squat? A broken rib. If I break your ribs, you're out of the game. So yeah, I might have an increased risk of injury. So obviously he was being very, very overdramatic, as am I. But I think what he was trying to say is just we don't want to swing the pendulum completely in the opposite direction. We don't want to be in this old school way of doing things where people would just break down, like, wow, just lift heavier weights, like, man up. Well, you break down that way, we get a lot of soft tissue injuries, bad things happen. But on the flip side, if all we do, and this is a really interesting story, actually. So when Ken Vick, who we'll see in a video in a second, the CEO of Velocity, when they went over to China for the first time, they brought through the FMSs. So one of the big things right now is China is kind of like the Wild West of strength and conditioning. So when we think of Chinese kind of Olympic athletes, we think of like their weightlifting teams, we think of their divers, like those are the ones that have all the funding, those are the ones that are like world class. They don't put as much money into like the soccer teams, they don't put as much money into like the field sport teams, the badminton teams per se. So one of the things they've been doing is outsourcing those contracts to like Exos, Velocity, other practitioners. That's where Mike, who used to work here, that's where he went, that's what he's doing at this point in time. But anyway, when Ken went over, he went over with a whole bunch of FMSs because they never did this stuff before. So his whole thing, just like we were discussing, we want to set up baselines, we want to get everything right. Something got lost in translation because all the athletes thought that their number one goal was to get perfect 21s on the FMS. So he came back 3 weeks later and was like, how's the weight training going? And they're like, we didn't do any weight training. They were just trying to master the test. So they all had perfect 21s, like they looked amazing, but believe it or not, they had their first competition in those 3 weeks, and they got absolutely obliterated because they didn't strength train, they didn't condition train, they didn't So it just it was an accident, but it just goes to show that and Tony Gentilcore has a really good piece on one of his blogs too. Like, good exercise, good training is corrective exercise. If you take someone through a deep squat, you're gonna get hip mobility. You're gonna get a lot of these good things. All right. So it isn't just necessarily having to always do some of this stuff, but it is important. All right.
I'll see you.
We'll see you. Thanks for stopping.
For Saturday?
You got it.
I'll see
So
you.
I think corrective exercise, it is important, but in the same token, it's inbuilt to your programs if you're picking appropriate exercises for people too, I would argue. And I just think sometimes, for some reason, this thought process gets kind of left out. I got to do my 15 minutes of shoulder external rotations, and I got to do my Y raises, I got to do all these things. And again, I'm not saying for 1 second they are not important, they are. But if you're spending 45 minutes out of your hour session doing them, I would argue maybe there's a better way of doing things. So we use corrective sequences to improve athletic movement and activation. But I do think when dealing with younger athletes, our main focus is to get the small stabilizing muscles to activate, teach proper movement. So yeah, we want to build good foundations, especially with youngsters. That's the beauty, is when they're that young, and they have those bad habits, we can train them to have good habits. That's why we love working with these young guys. We get them at 12, and we teach them how to do things safely and effectively at 12. That's why I think our training program works so well, because it is compound movements. It is coordination. I mean, you guys know just downstairs, we don't have any machines. There's no faking it. If you're doing a split squat, you're going to have to try to do that correctly. If you are doing our Olympic lifts, which we know have a tremendous amount of coordination, that's what makes them so good as well. Not only are you getting stronger, you're developing power, but also just the coordination element, if they're done correctly, is absolutely huge. But it just highlights what we already know, is we want to get this technique as good as we possibly can before we move on. We want to have people earn the right to lift heavy. But I think, the flip side is you don't want to just keep people, and this is what we were talking about the other day, Josh, when we were being our own harshest critics on the program. We don't want to just keep people at the lowest common level as well all the time. So it's, and this is where it's just, when do you push someone to the next step? When do you kind of scale them back? And it's an art, and I don't always have the answer, and I don't always get it right, but I think it's part of the art. Our adult population, we want to focus more on movement restrictions, such as tight hip flexors and poor thoracic mobility. I think one of the challenges when I'm, working with, say, Tammy, who I had last night, who just turned 50, she's got 30 years of poor movement quality and dysfunction. I'm not going to undo that in 2 months. All right, now that's not me just saying, I give up, not my problem. We're going to gradually try to get after it, but I think also in the same token, too, it's like, well, I'm just going to make you the best I can with what you have. All right, I'm going to gradually start to try to kind of get those things, but I'm not going to try to, get the slam dunk home run. I want to gradually, even if I get 1 degree of more hip flexion than she had, but I'm also trying to do it in a way where I'm training her to use a squat because maybe I want her to lean out a bit. Is there a way that I can combine those purposes? I think that for me, just kind of jumping on my little soapbox, is kind of one of the challenges I see a lot, or I've observed sometimes when I've worked in other gyms in the past. You'll see someone working with adults who are, morbidly obese, and they're just doing a whole bunch of corrective stuff. Cool, their shoulder function got better. They're going to die of diabetes in 4 years. Is that really going to be, like, and again, I'm being over dramatic. But I mean, it's just like, it's almost, and I think Eric Cressy had this great analogy in a recent podcast. It's like, if you totaled your car and the first thing you try to do is rebuild the radio. Like, let's think of the bigger picture. If I can, just even using that example, if I can have someone lose weight and they have less adipose tissue, and that brings that inflammatory response down, their tissue quality is going to go up. Guess what? They're going to move better just from doing that, not from me having to necessarily give them more internal or external rotation. Again, I'm not saying that's not important, but it's just like we have this periodized kind of approach to it. Is there a better way? And I think, one of the things too is, that's something that drives me insane, is sometimes, you'll see trainers, they're working with their clients, especially their adults, 6 months later they haven't lost a pound, they don't look any different. I mean, again, I'm not trying to, bash anybody, but are we losing sight sometimes of the bigger picture, So if we kind of look at it from a sports standpoint, we work with individuals who are looking to improve their performance. When we talk general populations, we're talking about quality of life, guys. If someone's in constant pain as well, this is an interesting thing too that Greg Cook said, which really kind of piqued my interest, is remember how we talked about last time that kind of model, that supercompensation, the whole way that training is based upon. We introduce a stimulus, they momentarily go down, they supercompensate, we get this kind of wave, they go up. Well, if you're in pain, you basically shut down that physiological process. It's very hard to get positive adaptations. So that's a really interesting thing. And I'm not talking about, I dislocated my elbow, my shoulder. I'm talking about if you have that back that's always cranky because you have such a jammed up thoracic spine, that all of a sudden those facet joints are taking a beating. So it's always that low-grade pain that you're just like, well, I just live with it. And we hear that sometimes when we do these strategy sessions with adults. Do you have any pain? Yeah, no, just my back. Yeah, I feel it all the time, but it's just, I'm old. What are you going to do? Well, no, we want to do something about that. Because if we don't fix that, and this is where I almost kind of go against what I just said to a degree, and like I said, it's not a black or white issue. Well, yes, if I'm using that same example, I want to lose weight with somebody, they're pre-diabetic, whatever, but they're in constant pain, it's going to limit the impact of my good programming. So this is where I think I want to look at a synergistic approach. Can I find a way to incorporate good corrective exercises, which is going to take away some of their pain, which is going to make the other stuff I do more effective, but again, not focus completely on one at the exclusion of the other. And I think that's where we sometimes get it wrong. So if we take a look at our adult population, we talk about it. This is just a recap. Painful joints, bad shoulders, bad hips, poor posture. These are just the things that we see. We can talk a little bit about readiness to train. This is a whole different thing. I mean, this is part of a different presentation, but I mean, it still makes sense to kind of go here because these are just some things that affect it. So when we get into some of this simulated strategy session stuff in a little bit, these are the things that people deal with. This is the big one. Did you see Brandon Marcello at all? You didn't see. He had a good one on sleeping and to perform better something. This is the number one most important yet ironically most neglected thing in society that we have today. It is the number one most restorative thing. And what's really interesting, my biggest takeaway from Brandon Marcello, Brandon was like, I am a nutritionist. I have a PhD in nutrition. Because now he's getting into sleep stuff. He was like, if I had to choose one or the other, I would choose sleep over nutrition. That is how important it is. But so many of us are sleep deprived. Poor sleep hygiene, poor sleep practices, and also we live in a society too, especially certain vocations and certain professions that some of our clientele and members are in where it's a badge of honor. Yeah, I've only gone on 4 hours of sleep. It's just what I do. I'm a lawyer. Like, I got to get it done. I'm a CEO. This is just what it is. This is how we do things. Yeah, but this is messing up everything. Poor sleep leads to huge inflammatory marker concentrations. It creates a whole negative cascade. I mean, I don't need to go into it, but bottom line is we need to get people sleeping as well. All right, digestion, and ironically, sleep affects all of these: digestion, immune response, mood, posture, reaction, all these things. Okay, so we have some FMS stuff. All right, but just kind of recap, kind of this. We have a total of 7 screens, 7 tests within the FMS. The best you could possibly get is a 21. I can't remember ever seeing a 21.
Just with the rotary stability.
That's the one that gets people.
Yeah.
But here's the thing too. That's an interesting point. So this was a podcast with I think Greg Cook was actually on. It was the Mike Boyle podcast, and they were talking about like how do they come up with this criteria of scoring? Because you think about it, you have a 1, 2, 3. Well, technically you have a 0, 1, 2, and 3. 0 is if any pain is responded whatsoever. They could have a perfect 3, but if they're like, yeah, that hurts me as I'm doing it, it's an automatic 0. It's usually a red flag. That's where we refer out to somebody. Okay, 3 is perfect, textbook, couldn't get any better. 1 or 2, means they're able to do the movement, but there's some sort of compensation. All right, a more extreme compensation, of course, denotes a 1. All right, so we tend to see, if you got of the 7 tests, a 2 on everything, you're looking at more at like a 14. Now, there is some research that shows the FMS scores less than 14 increases the probability of suffering time loss through injury. Now, what's interesting is looking at some of the research. There's certain research articles that show there is a correlation between the FMS to injury prevention and prediction. There's other studies that show it has nothing to do with it. Again, the truth is somewhere out there, all right, depending on what scientific lens you use. But before I go off into another tangent, if you think of that bell-shaped curve, 1 is on the far left, 3 is on the far right, 2 is basically kind of in the middle. That's why they pick 3 basic kind of scoring criteria. So they're like, if you're getting a 14, like you're average. They're like 3 is an outlier. Like we do not expect everyone to get 3s. But I think what's interesting is, again, for some reason it was misconstrued. I think a lot of us think like you're shooting for a 3. Like 3 is absolutely picture perfect. It's pretty rare to get a 3 on a lot of these tests. That's not saying, again, at the risk of contradicting myself, that we don't want to improve 2s, because this is where some people will then slam this, is they'll say that like, it's almost like the strength of the test. If you look at it from a statistical kind of robustness standpoint, is also its main weakness because it has such clear scoring criteria. Well, what if it's kind of like a 2.5? Technically, it's still a 2, and we see that it's like, well, I want to give that a 3, but their foot's still kind of externally rotating, so technically it's a 2. Versus, well, this is still technically a 2. So not all 2s are the same. Not all 1s are the same. So that's what people will say, like just from a scoring kind of criteria standpoint, and it's also very subjective. Again, it is your interpretation of what you are seeing. I mean, they have kind of their own, they have the packet, which we have on the drive, which basically shows you how to score the different tests, but it is still open to subjective kind of interpretation. But, they still give you very clear guidelines. But this is what we're trying to kind of look at. We're trying to give those kind of scores. All right? So like I said, unquestionability, it's perfect. This is just that traffic light system, ability to perform the movement, some degree of compensation. And a score of 1 is either an inability to perform it. It's not an inability. I mean, it's just like, I would say it's an inability. So classic example, if they fall down when they're trying to do something or they lose their balance, that's an automatic 1. or if they're just doing it and it just looks terrible. Like, they're able to do, case in point, they're able to do that stability push-up, but they literally worm themselves up in like a contortist in the circus. They get themselves there. Well, they were technically able to complete it, but that ain't a 3, and that's definitely not a 2. And this is where, again, it's part of your subjective interpretation. Yes.
So on like the single leg raise, being not able to get to 90 completely, would that be a 1?
Well, that particular test, so the way it works, and it's described kind of in the manual, basically 90 degrees is an automatic 3, and then you kind of just take different measurements, and if they fail the next one, then that's a 2, and so it depends on kind of just the ultimate like degree of where they can move their leg. So there is kind of a criteria kind of for that as well.
Okay, yeah, I should read that.
I mean that, and I mean we'll see if we can kind of get through that. But I mean, you are obviously, if you're sticking around, you can help me with the screen at 4. So the FMS attempts, so I pinpoint these weaknesses, ideas to individualize program, inefficient movements lead to injury. All right, I'm just going to try to breeze through this because there's a video I want to kind of get into in a second. So again, functional movement is basically, if we look at this pyramid schematic, it's pretty much the precursor to functional performance as well as functional skill. We want to have these movement capabilities down. This is your movement vocabulary. This is how you do stuff. If you don't have a functional movement ability, you're going to have some trouble. All right? Performance, it leads to skills. All right, so we don't need that. Let me just see. Okay, so there are other assessments, and this is the one thing I wanted to show too. So this is some footage that I took years ago. So one of the other big ones that's used in countries like Australia as well as the United Kingdom and throughout Europe is this guy Kelvin Giles, and he has something called physical competencies. So he would argue that Greg Cook's, all the things I just mentioned, Greg Cook is a little bit oversimplistic. So he's like, listen, he goes, I wanted to create a test that does similar things that Greg Cook does, but in the same token, he's like, I want to also do some dynamic stuff. Because that's another criticism of this. And I think Vern Gambetta famously blasted him on Twitter. Everything that we do, and let's see if you guys can figure out where I'm going with this. All the tests in the FMS are basically static tests. They're kind of almost in almost like a lab environment. It's a closed skill condition. You're stepping over something. You're stepping back. What's a potential problem with static tests?
In terms with athletes, how does this really translate to stuff we do on the field?
Yeah, you play your dynamic movement. It's, think about the agility training that we do, where we do deceleration. One of the reasons we do closed skill drills, so run to this cone, back pedal to this cone, we're trying to ingrain those patterns. But the whole point is they then become habitual, so when you are actually on the field and reacting to the ball moving, it becomes second nature. That's what we're trying to do. So if we're all of a sudden making these static assessments, that's one of the classic examples between static stretching, so flexibility versus mobility. So really interesting. Anybody know any martial artists? All right. Are they pretty flexible on the whole? Like, can they do splits and touch their toes? They're pretty awesome at that. You see them do it all the time. But I remember I had a friend who was, again, his static flexibility was amazing. He could do splits. I mean, this was back in like the 90s, like Bloodsport, Van Damme. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
All right, that was my first. That was my first purchase, by the way. My first like mini adult purchase. I had saved up money and I bought Bloodsport on VHS.
Can't wait till they redo it.
They're gonna redo that?
Who knows? They will one day, I hope.
I don't think you mess with that one.
And Van Damme be the Mr. Miyagi.
You can't mess with that. Bolo Young, that was a great film. Kickboxer too. Oh. Anyway, one of the issues exactly is, I don't even know what we're talking about. So we're talking about dynamic statics and mobility, yes. So I remember having the same martial artist friend, but you try to get him to like lift his leg to do a kick, and he couldn't lift his leg nearly as much. And I remember at the time when I was much younger, I couldn't figure that out. How can this guy who can do splits, he clearly has flexibility, but he can't lift his leg to execute like a side kick as well as he could. That doesn't make sense to me. And one of the issues, of course, is as soon as you go into these dynamic conditions, I mean, you think about it, we have a whole bunch of muscle actions. If I'm trying to lift my leg to kick someone in the face, I got stabilizers holding me. I got certain muscles that are acting as agonists, synergists, antagonists. So certain things are fixing, certain things are holding, certain things are moving, certain things are bracing. And basically the net effect of that is my ability to lift my leg to a certain degree. So what we're getting at is under dynamic conditions where you're actually playing and participating in your sport, well, you can have awesome flexibility, you can touch your toes, but if you have poor mobility, in other words, as soon as we enter dynamic conditions, you can't use it because there's a weakness in the chain or something is limiting that, well, you're kind of, what's the point? If that almost makes sense. So this is where kind of this Calvin Giles guy came up with his own battery of tests. And I don't think I have it on this slide. I have kind of them saved on my computer, which I'm happy to show. But in addition to just like single leg stance things, I'm going to show you guys a single leg squat. Like he has people jump, almost what we do in the accelerator class. Jump. Show me you can land on one leg. Show me you can land on two legs. Show me you can brace. Show me you can do this. And a lot of times you find these athletes. So here's a tale of two very different athletes. All right, here's one. And like I said, I know this isn't the best. Like you can see it more on the computer. This isn't exactly the best lighting in here. But what I am, so here's me somewhere. And I'm holding what looks like, and I have it downstairs, and I'll show you when we go downstairs in a second. It's like a giant like goniometer. And basically I'm just going to have him hold a single leg squat. So watch this guy's body position when he does it. You can get the idea. Pretty flat back. Now watch this guy. Can we kind of see the difference? I know the lighting's kind of terrible. He's basically curled into a ball. So whereas the first guy is pretty much like this guy is like that. So he was an international player. He spent 3/4 of the season out injured. So like I said, it's always a case study of one, but the fact of the matter is, bringing this conversation full circle, there is a need for assessment, all right? It showed, and in this particular case, he couldn't handle his own body under static conditions. So how the hell was he going to handle his body under dynamic conditions? And he was also someone, too, that, using him as a case study, he had some really big surgeries and stuff, bad diet, didn't sleep. I mean, if you were to look at literally a laundry list of all the things that we talked about in terms of poor sleep, poor diet, lifestyle, he was a professional athlete, but in the same token, like he was hurt all the time. And I think structurally it just highlighted the fact, too, that, we need to do some different stuff with him. We tried, and I think they tried after. I think ultimately he lost his contract. But I think it just kind of highlights kind of a tale of two very, very different athletes.
Is that right?
Yes. I remember what years ago that was. But just as we're doing that, guys, let's do a quick time check as well. What are we looking at? 3:20. Okay, we should be good.
12%.
Yeah, but if we get that is nope, don't need to see that. Let me just see, because there's another video I want to get, which I'll put on as I grab a lead. I'm just trying to figure out where I put it. So this is kind of talking about, so what I want to do is I want to now kind of just take a moment. We went through a little bit of the FMS. If we don't get to actually do some of the practice stuff today like we've done in the past, of course I'll set aside time to do that because I obviously want to make this hands-on. Today was a little bit more kind of theoretical, just understanding it. But now I want to kind of get into, before we head into 4 o'clock, like the actual strategy session. Because as I said, a part of this too, it's not only just creating that baseline assessment, that's key, but this is an invaluable sales process for us because this is how we garner interest. And like I said, this is how we establish our credibility. We show what we're all about as a company. And I think what's really cool is when we get it right, parents, athletes come away with it thinking like, wow, these guys really know their stuff. This is an awesome training center. But most importantly, like they get me and they're going to get me to where I want to be. And I think, this is where it's part of the intangible stuff. I think we can all appreciate as practitioners, how do I get your FMS overhead squat better? How do I get you stronger? I mean, all these things, we understand that. But it's just like, dare I say it, and I've sat in on some of these things in the past in other places where people just will leave because they don't feel like you care or you're listening to them. And that's not anyone's fault. No one's trying to do that. But, sometimes we almost have these pre-populated responses like, okay, this is exactly what you need to do. But they're not telling you that. They're not saying that. Does that almost kind of make sense? I know I'm being a little bit vague and cryptic. I'm not trying to be. But let me try to pull up the Ken Vick video, which is in the systems manual. I'm just trying to remember where I put the systems manual. Well, let me do this. Derek, could you just run downstairs and just see if we have another white Apple lead? Worst case, there's usually one on the front desk by the small laptop which you can steal. Absolute worst case, there's one on my desk. It's like tangled around the desk. You just have to grab it. Thank you.
It's an Apple
Lead.
charger. I don't speak Apple vocabulary.
No, I think that's just my own weirdness. Because you actually write it as a charger.
Oh, okay.
I think lead is actually a UK thing.
Ah,
You live there, man. Come on.
it's not long enough.
It's not enough to root for them yesterday.
No, God, no.
Well, it's because of that they lost. You know that. Like the energy you put out into the universe. I blame you entirely.
Blew it.
They blew it. They blew it.
Funny you brought up the how China's doing the outside contracts.
Mm-hmm.
I got offered a job last year. You know Ron McKeefrey?
Yeah.
Yeah, he offered me a job. I was like, I just started grad school.
Oh, that
Is
works.
the wrong one?
No, that works.
It is?
Did you know Ron specifically?
No, but through Joe Connolly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he referred me, and then I was just like, oh, I literally just started grad school. I just signed a lease on an apartment.
Yeah.
It was awesome. Like, we had 2 paid vacations every year to fly you back home. Free food, free housing.
It's not a bad. I mean, it's not a bad gig.
Yeah.
But it's it's intense, of what I understand.
Oh, yeah. Being the way I look at it, I don't really have like a significant other, so it's easy for me to really.
Well, what's interesting is the. I mean, fair play to him, but the director at the Velocity in Redondo Beach is doing it for Ken, and he's doing it on like a year contract. Like he just got married, so it's just like, okay,
Awesome first year.
that's good. Good luck. Have fun. All right, guys, let me just find this damn systems manual. I think it's in the coaches meeting CPD. Yes, this is what I want. Let me pull this up because the link is here. So I'm just going to put on a little video that Ken does. So this is Ken, CEO of Velocity. And it's a little bit more geared towards kind of the sports performance side of things. But I think he does a really good job, in my opinion, of just like walking through a little bit of strategy session stuff as well. There's also some other YouTube videos that I've uploaded. Like he did his own presentation on strategy session and stuff like that. So, I wasn't going to, when we continue, we'll probably watch that one together. But I'll pull this up too. I love it when things don't work. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
What do you got there?
Handful of
What kind? Are those honey roasted?
Mhm.
Good man. Alright, let me just find the execute strategy session support.
All set too?
I am all set, but thank you. That's what I want. Okay. That's what I want. Come on.
So, after you have been on the floor, you've done the assessments, you started the discussion, the goal setting, the awareness and the teaching during the test itself. Now you're coming back into your conference room or your office. You have mom and dad, you have we see out there during the test? What did we find as strengths and weaknesses? What are we going to do about it in training? What are the right programs? And then what are the results we expect to see? So that's the process you're going to go through, those 4 points. So you can sit down, again, talk with athletes. We've already started this, but continue down the path. What do you want to get better at this year? If this works in 3 months, what are you going to see different? We're going to know this worked well, and the training was worth it when you go out on the court and you do what? Find out what they really want. Dig past the bigger, faster, stronger, I want to move better. Get into the details. And really, if you're good, try to find the why. What's the motivation? And do that with mom and dad as well. Dad, what are you really hoping to see Johnny get out of this training? Find out what they're thinking as well. They're not always on the same page. Mom, dad, athlete, they might not all be thinking the same thing. So this conversation is really important because you don't want to be at the other end. When you've had 3 months of training, you kick butt and this guy's stronger than he ever was, and mom goes, nope, that's not what we wanted. Or dad's not happy with that, or athlete's not happy. You've got to make sure you're chasing the right goals. So find the goals. Then you look at, all right, great. With that in mind, here's what I saw. I see that your strength and power levels are here. I see your speeds here. We saw this injury, whatever it is. Now, we really want to make this specific to them. So always share some general strengths and weaknesses, but let's make it specific. So Johnny, you told me you want to be faster this year so you can make JV in baseball. Specifically, you have to get better getting on base and getting to first faster. That's what coach gave you feedback. It's the speed on the base run. So here's what we saw. We saw that your vertical jump, your power, the explosiveness of your body, that's a pretty good level. You're up here for your age group. You know, you're in the upper part, so you're doing really well on power. But the other piece of speed is good technique. And what we saw was your 10-yard time. That's an indication of your acceleration. So, Dad, you saw when we were doing that test with the timers? That 10-yard time is acceleration. And what we saw there was it's just lower than it should be, especially considered where your power's at. So along with that and what I saw coaching is we got to work on your technique. So I made some notes here on your technique, specifically your extension and your range of motion, getting a really, really good drive base. So that's going to be one of our big pieces to focus on. So you want to tie things that you're seeing in the test results to their goals. Range of motion, strength, power, movement technique, deceleration, whatever is appropriate. You're the coach. This is what you better know. You're going to tie that into their goals and what they want to achieve. Now, one of the big pieces here to point out as well is that this is where we may jump into sports medicine. Very often during the screening, one, we find pain. If we have pain, we want to figure out what's going on, and so we want to look into that deeper. That's where we'll go into our injury screenings, our orthopedic evaluations with our sports medicine partners, your PT in-house or your DC, your ATC, depending on how your setup is. But you want to be able to do that. So if you find pain, now we're sitting down having a conversation. Mom, Dad, here's what we saw. And during this test, or during this screening, we found that Johnny had pain on his right knee. Talking about it, said it's something that kind of always aches him over the last year and a half or so. So here's what we're going to do. When we have pain, we want to find out why it's happening. What are the things contributing to it? Because pain will change his movement mechanics. It'll make him perform worse, and it puts him at risk of more injury. You might jump right to the orthopedic evaluation. Say we have a situation where, we had Susie here, and she's a volleyball player. So, Dad, Susie, those tests where you felt that pain when you put your shoulder behind, your hand behind your back, right? And how it was hard to get up all the way overhead. So here's what we saw, Dad. You can see on our upper body injury risk score here that she's in a D. And the things that went into that were some of her range of motion. She couldn't quite get that arm overhead. She couldn't rotate it. We also saw some limits in rotational abilities. And if the body can't rotate, then we know there's more stress on the shoulder, especially in the upper thoracic. So you go through the injury risks. So what we need to do about it, first what I would recommend, this is what we do with our elite athletes and our professionals. First, we look for it. Let's make sure we know what's going on. So she's got a little bit of pain there. She's got quite a few risks. We would like to get her with our sports medicine specialist and do a full functional orthopedic eval. So during this, what they do is the PT is going to take her. They're going to thoroughly evaluate the shoulder joint and all the surrounding structures, but they're also going to look beyond that and see what's contributing to this. Do we need to work on soft tissue? Is it rotator cuff? Is it joint stability? Is there something bigger going on? Don't think there is, but that's why we have our sports medicine
Is
people.
this still the what are we going to do?
And at this point, sign them up for that process. I'm going to give them the appropriate service. Now, that's a service that has an additional cost to it, but that's what's right for my athlete. So this is an opportunity to sell them the services that they need. So sports medicine is one of the most common. Now, there's other things you might find based on their goals. Then your evaluation of where they're at, their strengths and weaknesses, you may see they need some other things. Perhaps you now need to talk about, if we really want to get those goals in the next 4 weeks like you talked about, we're going to get your technique better with our developmental class. You're going to increase some strength and power. You're good, but you'll still get better. We're going to get some mobility, but I think we can speed that up. If we were to do privates once a week or twice a week, that process would get a little bit faster. So that's something to consider. She's going to make progress in this developmental 2 class, but if we really want to get everything we can out of 4 weeks, the reality is we got to get more serious and more focused. So this is a great opportunity to talk about private training. That private training might center around mobility, core and corrective exercise, or maybe it's around technique, or maybe it's around specific strength and power. Depending on what you saw, it might be any of those. So now you can start talking about and directing your client, directing that athlete to the things that are going to help them achieve their goals. That's what we're here for. And if our business is set up right, we can deliver those things. They're valuable. We can charge for them. This is how you take your basic training membership and now get better results and build a better business. This is one of the most important steps to do that after the assessment, when you have specific needs, specific goals. Put them into the program that's going to help them the most. So we've gone through really looking at what their goals were, parents, coaches, athletes, making sure we dig in and try to find out what they're doing. Then number 2, we're looking at what we saw. Okay, we have to be able to do this on the fly, walking off the floor. We were making notes on our sheet. If you guys are set up well, the data can be entered directly and you can have a report very quickly. Just depends on your format. But even without a report, looking at that data sheet, every good coach who is a sports performance director or an assistant sports performance director has got to have the skill to be able to do this. If not, they're not good enough to be doing the assessment. So you look at it, you've determined what the strengths and weaknesses were, how they did apply to the specific goals. And then we went to step 3. What are the solutions? What are we going to do? Here's a program. Here's sports medicine. Or it may just be, here's what we're going to do within your training. We saw you need mobility here. We're going to use this mobility sheet. We're going to teach you how to do this so that you can do in between some of your strength exercises.
Are you out of here?
And Dad, this is going to be different for Susie because she has some specific needs. So you might see different athletes in the class doing different things. These are for her. When you get good at this as well, and we've taught you, this is something I want you to think about doing right before your volleyball game. This is something you might be doing at home so you can really take care of this or after practice. You might talk about how you're going to adjust the strength program. Mom, based on what we saw with Jack here, Jack, really good work today. Everything was just right in that nice progression as an 8th grader. He's moving along well. But we did see that right now he's having some problems with single leg stability and core control, especially when we got him into certain positions. So we're going to modify his strength program a little bit so that we can get that better. It's going to have a little bit more emphasis on hip and building that single leg stability before we just add a lot of load and make him strong. Now, Jack, I know you said it. You want to get stronger and bigger. So here's the secret. If we first make you good at this, controlling that action, being able to harness that strength you got, then when we start building the strength, you will pass way faster. You will take off. It's going to be a little slower at the start, but man, you're going to shoot forward. More importantly, you're going to be able
So the
to
thing with this, guys, is you kind of get the idea.
like you said you wanted
I just
to.
wanted to kind of
Okay.
show Ken's kind of words from the man, the myth himself. But I think the biggest thing is it's just understand their why. Have that communication with the parents. I mean, the only thing I would disagree with is we don't really see that much pain, to be honest. It's pretty rare with the kids. So, knock on wood. But I think it's what I like about his kind of description is he's establishing that credibility. You know, so it's just like he's relating everything to the test. I think that, in my opinion, with these things, when you're sitting down, you're speaking to the parents, you're going over kind of some of the results. So let's even do that.
Well, so there were 4 pieces. There was why, there was what we saw, there was what are we going to do about it, and then how do you get the last one.
I mean, I would even say those 3 are the most important. But let's pull up a test, like some actual results, so we can see what we're kind of looking at. So I've created a video that shows you how to create these things. It's very easy, but we do have a template here as well. So basically, just to kind of recap, and this is going to happen in literally the next kind of 20 minutes. Let me just see. Oh, that's a good sign.
No wheel of death.
No wheel of death, yeah. Let me just pull up any report. Yeah, I want more. There we go. Let's see. Let's do this. So you guys have seen these sheets around. You know, Derek, you were spending most day helping to file these sheets, which I appreciate.
That took a while for her. I think I found her.
I think you found she should be pretty new. Now I have to see you. You jinxed me. No, it's loading. It's just taking forever. I just have a lot of things running on this guy. Done.
It's a lot of tabs too.
Yeah. So this is a typical report. So you guys have seen kind of these printouts from before. So the way this works is, you know, athlete and parent come in, they come down, usually Chris Perry or Jasmine are going to be downstairs. We have a release form, you know, so just like anything, it's just a standard form that they sign. It lets us know if there's any injuries we need to be aware of. It basically just says, like, you know, you're fully, it's a legal document. It basically lets us know, like, you know, you understand that there's risk of any exercise, yada, yada, yada. You guys kind of get the idea. So they fill out that release. And then usually what happens is, you know, Chris, or it's usually Chris, will kind of start speaking to the parents, and then they'll hand, you know, the athlete off to you. So we're talking youth strategy sessions right now, sports performance. Adults are a little bit different. And then based on a video that we saw all the way back with the 2 coaches, we take them through the whole testing battery. We take them through the FMS first, and then we take them through those different performance tests. So again, in terms of the different performance tests, you know, we have our vertical jump, which we use to measure power in this case. We have a 20-yard sprint. We have a 5-10-5 pro agility, that hex test, and then we have a 300-yard shuttle test. And if I explore this kind of interface a little bit more, you know, what's neat about it is it just gives you a breakdown of what power, speed, agility, because here's the thing too. It's always getting that balance right, in my opinion, because we want to establish our credibility, just like I mentioned, but you still want to speak the same language. You know, so Derek, imagine, you know, you're a father of a son, and I'm speaking to you and I say, well, you know, his thoracic mobility is really poor and I think his extension qualities need some work. We know what you're talking about. Like, I'm just going to be like, okay. Doesn't mean anything to me. You know, so again, I think it's finding that balance where sounding smart versus you're just going way over their head and just using a whole bunch of big words that mean nothing to them. But that's, I think, why I wanted to show you the video with Ken is it's just, there's a way that you can do both, where you relate it to that person. Hey, you know, I couldn't help but notice that when you were sprinting, you know, your arms were a little bit jammed up. You know, we call that extension, being able to actually open up. You're not opening up as well as you could. If we can just teach you how to do that better, you are going to unlock some speed. So already, you know, just in a statement like that, I've established my credibility. You know, I tied it into something scientific, but more or less I put it into something that person's going to understand. Got it. My arms aren't moving. Versus you have poor extension qualities. You know, only people within our field are really going to understand that. So I think, you know, it's always just catering to your kind of audience. You know, one of the things that I use when I go over these tests. So, you know, this was Liz's test. So we plug in all the data, and like I said, there's a video that shows you how to kind of do this. But it's pretty easy. You know, FMS scores basically are just entered here. So we have that raw sheet that you write on. You enter the FMS scores here. All right, so if I were to change this to a 3, it will automatically update it on the spider diagram. So been looking at the FMS first. These are all the tests. So this is just a basic spider diagram, radar graph, same thing. They're called different things by different people. But basically what it just shows is it's just like blue are her scores, yellow are functional, or excuse me, this green is kind of a functional score. So you notice that all the scores are quote-unquote functional if there's a 2. So we saw in her case that she actually was beyond functional in certain kind of abilities. This is a little confusing for people, and this is just the way the corporate created it, so this isn't our thing. Well, what's nice about it is we all know that that number is out of 21. So she had an 18. Like, that's pretty solid.
You want to be outside the green, I take it.
You want to be on the green or outside the green, because like I said, even if you had a 14, technically, like, you got a 2 on everything. Like, that's still okay. That's still pretty decent. Interestingly enough, this should probably be a different color. But for some of the other tests, I don't know why.
So you go right down.
Yeah, you can head down. Well, you know, let's even just continue this, Josh. I'll continue this specifically with you, Derek. I'll keep you for another kind of few minutes, but yeah, just so you get ready. And I'll head down actually in a minute as well, just because I know we got to get ready. What I was going to say, totally forgot what I was going to say. It was something about just looking at this score. Like something's a little bit off with the sheet. I got to change it. Question as I'm dealing with that.
Why isn't there balance on that?
What do you mean balance?
Actually, is that part of quickness, really?
What do you mean by balance?
Just ability to, I guess all the functional movement really, they measure balance, but I feel like I see power, speed, agility, quickness. And all of it is measuring balance anyways, but there isn't like a specific.
Well, this is what, but this knowing the FMS hurdle step over, you're on one leg, that's
Right.
balance. Seeing the inline lunge is also likewise balance. So I mean, it's not called balance, but this is where balance. I mean, when we think balance, think more stability. Like, what is balance? Balance is stability. Balance is being able to create, particular muscle contractions that help stabilize and fixate kind of, movers to anatomical structures. So
the total score basically is a balance score.
do you mean? I mean, let me ask you this: when you say balance, do you mean the ability to balance, or do you mean like a balanced, like? Because I know balance can be used.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly stability, but anywhere from both the static and the dynamic aspect. So like, let's say someone's tripping and they're trying to run and stay up.
Mhm.
That's that whole range from one leg to tripping.
But this is where, and this is kind of what Ken was talking about. That's a good question. This is where that's what's good discussion for, kind of like the discussion. If you notice someone kind of like tripping and stuff like that, 'cause something like balance is very hard to quantify. How do you qualify balance? I mean, it's like you could do it if you were on a balance beam. Like, okay, how long can you stand on this without falling off?
Yeah.
But then it's just like something like sprint technique. Unless you're doing a full biomechanical analysis with like sensors and stuff, you know where I'm kind of going with it. So I think that what's nice about kind of this, we'll head down in a second too, is it provides you with, these are discussion points more than anything. I think that's the biggest takeaway. This is not and it's back to that point I made earlier. So this is not a diagnostic tool. This is the be all end all. This is absolute, gospel. These are just discussion points. Hey, compared to other things, in this case, hurdle step over, we know what that test kind of measures. She had some tight hips. You happen to be a soccer player. If you have tight hips, that's going to have an impact on your ability to get around the field, because your hips are tight. It's like trying to ride your bike with the brakes on. Like, you're going to be able to move, but there's going to be some resistance that's going to prevent you from moving as fast as you could. We need to try to just loosen off those hips, and we do that at the start of our class. So, and this is where I'll kind of end it for people that are kind of watching this. These tests are basically exactly that. They are providing you with bullet point reference points to discuss, and I'll explain this more when we do the second half of this. But we're looking at kind of these things. If someone's below average or they need kind of remedial work on certain things. That's not me saying, hey, you're bad at agility. It's just, this is an area of opportunity. This is where I can get you better, compared to these other scores. This is a good place to be. And I think that's the narrative that I want to try to have with people. Like, this is a good thing. This shows us that we have so much potential that we can basically fulfill, which is awesome. And then I just kind of put some areas of need and stuff. But I will start up again, finishing up this piece. But I just wanted to kind of show this. But like I said, Josh is down there. We got to huddle up.
Okay.
So anybody that's watching, again, thank you for joining. And this will be posted live. Cool.
Oh, so